Hi folks, Seth Leapson here. Thanks for watching my monologue. In these uncertain times, you may be thinking about personal protection. If you are, I urge you to visit my friends at Guns Etc. They'll help you find the perfect protection for yourself and your family, and they can even teach you how to use it. They've been protecting Arizonans for over 33 years, and they stand for the great principles this country was founded upon. Or you can just click on gunsetc.com. And if you like my monologues, please subscribe to 960 The Patriots YouTube channel. Welcome back and happy January 18th, 2021. Today the nation commemorates Martin Luther King Jr. Day, or tries to, or should. I've had a long relationship to this holiday, and while it's impossible to know what King's politics would be today, it's not inappropriate to point out that not every civil rights worker in the 1960s would be a liberal Democrat today. For example, Reverend King's closest friend and associate Ralph Abernathy endorsed Ronald Reagan in 1980. James Meredith, the first black man to be admitted to the University of Mississippi and a leader of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, was a Republican and ran for office as a Republican. He even worked for Jesse Helms at one point in his life. Why do I raise this as a point? There are other points to make here too, and I will momentarily, but the reason I make this point is that, while many may wrap themselves in the mantle and symbolism of Martin Luther King Jr., and many in the commentariat and policy worlds have forged the civil rights movement of yesterday and today into a representation of liberalism in the Democratic Party, it's simply not at all clear or evident that the two are the same, or even that the two stand for the same thing today. Let us remember Martin Luther King's Jr. commitment to our national moral condition. As I quoted last Friday in one of his most famous sermons, he said, "It is midnight within the moral order. At midnight, colors lose their distinctiveness and become a sullen shade of gray. Moral principles have lost their distinctiveness. For modern man, absolute right and wrong are a matter of what the majority is doing. Right and wrong are relative to likes and dislikes and the customs of a particular community. We have unconsciously applied Einstein's theory of relativity, which properly described the physical universe, to the moral and ethical realms. Midnight is the hour when men desperately seek to obey the 11th commandment, thou shalt not get caught. According to the ethic of midnight, the cardinal sin is to be caught and the cardinal virtue is to get by. It is all right to lie, but one must lie with finesse. It is all right to steal, if one is so dignified that, if caught, the charge becomes embezzlement, not robbery. It is permissible even to hate, if one so dresses his hate in the garments of love that hating appears to be loving. The Darwinian concept of the survival of the fittest has been substituted by a philosophy of the survival of the slickest. The mentality has brought a tragic breakdown of moral standards, and the midnight of moral degeneration deepens. To speak of moral standards and moral degeneration is to speak a language the modern Democratic Party has abjured totally and completely. I hope the Republican Party, in all its rethinking, does not do the same thing. But let me continue on the legacy of civil rights just a moment. Many in the civil rights movement of the 1960s have moved pretty far from liberal orthodoxy today. Rabbi Mark Gellman, for example, ties his civil rights understandings to his support for a pro-life position on abortion. And while this time of year usually also witnesses the annual March for Life, perhaps it's not so wrong to quote something Reverend Jesse Jackson once said. Listen to this. There are those who argue that the right to privacy is of higher order than the right to life. I do not share that view. I believe that life is not private, but rather it is public and universal. If one accepts the position that life is private and therefore you have the right to do with it as you please, one must also accept the conclusion of that logic. That was the premise of slavery. You could not protest the existence or treatment of slaves on the plantation because that was private and therefore outside of your right to be concerned. What happens to the mind of a person and the moral fabric of a nation that accepts the aborting of the life of a baby without a pang of conscience? What kind of person and what kind of society will we have 20 years hence if life can be taken so casually? It is that question. The question of our attitude, our value system, and our mindset with regard to the nature and worth of life itself that is the central question confronting mankind. Failure to answer that question affirmatively may leave us with a hell right here on earth. Close quote. That viewpoint used to suffuse the civil rights movement. You can still hear it from Alveda King, but not much elsewhere. Now move with me away from abortion politics for a moment and think about race politics. Quite simply put, is it more moral to think of people and give some of those people benefits because of the color of their skin while we take opportunities from others?
But we barrel through it.
That's
what the purpose of the 3-second rule is
really
all about.
That, in essence, is what affirmative action today has
It's
come
about
to mean. In the
suppressing your
1950s
fear
and
by just going in
1960s,
right
the
away.
civil rights effort was to take race out,
But sometimes you gotta hold
extirpate it
back
from any decision-making at all. To hew to that position today is to be called racist. Think of the times we are in. Not taking race into account is racist. Taking race into account is a commitment to anti-racism. The King ethic was integration. Somehow, today it is more in step to separate, once again, segregate by race, be it dorm rooms or graduation ceremonies or elsewhere. Another interesting and ignored or forgotten aspect of Martin Luther King is how much of the tradition of the West he absorbed and used or taught. As William Bennett pointed out, quoting Arthur Schlesinger, Martin Luther King did pretty well with Thoreau, Gandhi, and Reinhold Niebuhr as models. And remember, after all, whom King and his father were named for. The record hardly shows that Eurocentric education had such a terribly damaging effect on the psyche of black Americans then. Why deny it to black children today?
Now,
Martin Luther King embraced the West, the philosophical tradition of the West, the universalism of Western philosophy, and believed that tradition was the tradition that led to the liberation of black men and black women and white women. From Morehouse to Crozier Theological Seminary, where King studied, King immersed himself in the writings of great philosophers, also from the West. From Plato and Aristotle, he wrote, down to Rousseau, Hobbes, Bentham, Mill, and Locke. Here with these teachers was planted the seed not of a contemplative life, but of a life of action, a life of thoughtful devotion to political reform, to the pursuit of justice, in the broader sense, equality, liberty, and the dignity of all people. King turned to the great philosophers because he needed to know the answers to certain questions. What is justice? What should be loved? What deserves to be defended? What can I know? What should I do? What is man? As a result of the way in which King answered those questions, out of and through the Western tradition, Jim Crow was destroyed and American history was transformed. I have no objection in case anybody is interested as students studying cultures that are not Western. I think that's fine, but they should not be denied access to the best and greatest philosophical tradition in the world, the one that has transformed society around the world, the one that is the intellectual and moral and political currency, not only of the world that developed in the West, but for all people. And students, black or white, would all be better to imitate what Martin Luther King did, rather than our current trend. You see, what we get in the Western tradition, in a way I think it is missed elsewhere, is the right of the individual over the group or anything else. And with that right, the right to also have sovereignty and to think individually and to act for self and societal correction. Summoning his learning from Western philosophy, King wrote in a letter from Birmingham jail the following, quote, "How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal and natural law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority, and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. In short, it diminishes the role and special uniqueness of being a human being. As much as we spoke last week of the law of consent and minority rights, the entire theory of freedom and equality being the sheet anchor of consent, few taught it as well as Martin Luther King. Lincoln put it this way, "As I would not be a slave, I would not be a master." He would write, "No man is good enough to govern another man without that other's consent." Lincoln would say this is the leading principle, the sheet anchor of American republicanism. Good word, that, sheet anchor. You know what it means originally? It's a nautical term, a large spare anchor used in an emergency. But the point I'm making, King was making, Lincoln was making, that Jefferson outlined, might does not make right, and majorities in a Republican form of government or democracy must respect minority rights if the democracy is to continue. That is how consent is achieved. King put it this way, quote, "Let us consider a more concrete example of just and unjust laws. An unjust law is a code that a numerical or power majority group compels a minority group to obey but does not make binding on itself. This is difference made legal. By the same token, a just law is a code the majority compels the minority to follow and that it is willing to follow itself. This is sameness made legal. Let me give another explanation. A law is unjust if it is inflicted on a minority that, as a result of being denied the right to vote, had no part in enacting or devising that law." And finally, as we've spoken before of as well, King was fond of the founding. He found all of these arguments in our founding. He did not try to change our founding or its date. He wanted us to relearn it and concretize it, recommit to it. Thus, he would call our Constitution and Declaration of Independence magnificent, just as Frederick Douglass would before him, calling them freedom documents. We could all use a bit more of that King right now. Actually, a lot more of it just now. Starting with what Martin Luther King Jr. said in August of 1963. "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." By the way, the title of that most famous march in 1963 was March for Jobs and Freedom. I'm Seth Leibson. We'll be right back.